My brother-in-law called me a dinosaur on a Tuesday. He said it with a smile, the kind that's supposed to take the sting out but never does. I was standing in the hallway outside the boardroom at Meridian Structural Group, holding a coffee I hadn't touched yet, and he looked at me the way you'd look at an old dog you've already decided to put down. That was 3 weeks before the biggest infrastructure review in the company's history, and 32 days before my $118,000 performance bonus was set to transfer. I want to tell you how it ended. But first you need to understand what I built. My name is not important. What matters is this. I spent 24 years with the Ontario Ministry of Transportation before I moved to the private sector. 24 years inspecting bridges, signing off on structural assessments, writing the reports that either greenlit a project or stopped it cold. When I left the ministry in 2011, I took with me something that no university course teaches and no software platform replicates: a professional engineer's stamp, a federally recognized certification in bridge load-bearing assessment, and 11 years of documented file history with Transport Canada. Meridian Structural Group hired me in 2012. They were a mid-sized firm out of Hamilton, good reputation, honest work. The owner, a man I'll call my original boss, was the kind of person who actually walked job sites in his 60s. He shook my hand the day I joined and said, "We don't cut corners here." I believed him. For 12 years, I had no reason not to. My wife used to joke that I was more married to Meridian than to her. She wasn't entirely wrong. I knew every active contract, every subcontractor relationship, every outstanding variance report. When a federal infrastructure renewal grant came through in 2022, a $94 million contract to assess and certify 43 highway overpasses across southern Ontario, I was the one who built the methodology. I was the lead signing engineer. My professional stamp was on every preliminary report submitted to the Federal Project Office. That's not a small thing. In Canada, a licensed professional engineer stamp is a legal instrument. It carries personal liability. You cannot transfer it like a company asset. It belongs to the individual who earned it. My original boss understood this perfectly. His son-in-law did not. My sister-in-law married him 7 years ago. I won't pretend I ever warmed to him. He had an MBA from a school I'd never heard of, and an opinion on everything he'd never actually done. When my original boss started talking about retirement in early 2023, the son-in-law, I'll call him exactly what he was, the son-in-law, started showing up at Meridian more often. Sitting in on meetings he hadn't been invited to, sending emails with "per my understanding," and going forward we should align on. By the fall of 2023, he had an office. By January 2024, he had a title: Chief Operating Officer. He was 34 years old and had never once stood underneath a bridge with a flashlight and a load calculator. I kept my head down. I had 18 months left on the federal contract. My employment agreement had a performance clause. If the project reached Phase 3 completion with 0 federal compliance flags, I received the $118,000 bonus. We were on track. We had never had a compliance flag. I had made sure of it personally. The son-in-law had other ideas. He started talking about modernizing the assessment workflow. He wanted to bring in a software platform, American-built, not certified for Canadian federal infrastructure standards, but sleek-looking on a slide deck. He talked about it constantly. He said the words scalable and future-proof in almost every sentence. When I pointed out, in writing, that the platform he was proposing had not received Transport Canada certification and could not legally be used as the basis for federal sign-off, he looked at me the way people look at a smoke detector that keeps going off. He told me I was resistant to change. I told him I was resistant to losing our federal contract. He stopped inviting me to certain meetings after that. The morning of March 14th started like any other. I drove in from Ancaster, stopped at the Tim Hortons on Rymel, got my large double-double. The parking lot at the office was fuller than usual for a Thursday. The son-in-law's Audi was there, which was unusual before 9. I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked near the front entrance. I found out what the car was for about 40 minutes later. He called me into the boardroom. HR was there, the HR director, a woman who'd been with Meridian 6 years and who couldn't look me in the eye. The son-in-law sat at the head of the table, which was my original boss's chair, and he had a folder in front of him. He told me my position was being eliminated. Restructuring. He used the word streamlining. He said Meridian was moving in a new direction and my role no longer aligned with the company's evolving needs. I sat there for a moment. The HR director slid a termination package across the table. 4 weeks' pay in lieu of notice, no mention of the bonus, no mention of the federal contract, no mention of the 43 bridges currently sitting in phase 2 assessment with my stamp on the preliminary reports. I asked about the performance bonus. The son-in-law said the bonus was contingent on employment at time of payout. Since my employment was ending today, the bonus would not be paid. I asked if he had spoken to my original boss about this decision. He said the decision had been made at the executive level. I picked up the termination package. I thanked the HR director. I did not shake his hand. I walked to my office, packed the personal items that were actually mine. A framed photo of my daughter at her university graduation, a coffee mug, a reference binder I'd built myself over 12 years, and I left. In the parking lot, I sat in my truck for about 10 minutes. My wife called, because she always knew when something was wrong even before I told her. I told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Did you bring your binders?" I told her I had. She said, "Good." My wife is smarter than I give her credit for. She knew even then what I was only beginning to understand. Here is what the son-in-law did not know, or chose not to care about. My employment contract with Meridian had been negotiated in 2019, when the federal infrastructure grants were first being discussed, and my original boss wanted to lock in my commitment. My lawyer at the time, a contract specialist in Hamilton I'd used for years, had insisted on specific language. The professional certification provisions, as we called them, were clear. For any active federal project bearing my professional engineering stamp, Meridian could not substitute another signing engineer without my written consent and a formal continuity application to Transport Canada. Furthermore, my departure from the company did not automatically transfer the certification file to Meridian. The certification was personal. The files was mine. Additionally, and this is the part that mattered most, the performance bonus was tied not to a calendar date but to project milestones. The clause read, and I had read it many times, that the bonus would be paid upon achievement of Phase 3 completion, or upon the employee's departure if Phase 2 was substantially complete, and no replacement engineer had been formally certified by Transport Canada on the project file. We were in Phase 2. No replacement had been certified. I had been the only engineer on the file for 2 years. The son-in-law had fired the project. He just didn't know it yet. I didn't call anyone that day. I didn't post anything, didn't complain to mutual contacts, didn't reach out to the federal project office. I went home, made dinner. My wife handled the pasta, I did the chicken. We've had that arrangement for 20 years. And I called my lawyer after dinner. He listened to the full story without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Did they give you anything in writing about the bonus?" I told him yes. The termination letter explicitly stated the bonus was forfeited due to end of employment. He said, "Good. That's what we needed." The next morning, he sent a letter to Meridian's legal department on my behalf. It was 3 pages long. It outlined the certification provisions, the milestone-based bonus language, and the fact that under the current contract structure, my professional stamp remained the controlling authority on the federal project file until either I consented to a transfer or Transport Canada approved a new signing engineer, a process that, under federal guidelines, takes a minimum of 60 to 90 days and requires documentation I controlled. Until that process was complete, Phase 3 could not legally proceed. Phase 3 was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. I heard nothing for 4 days. On the 5th day, my original boss called me, not the son-in-law's. My original boss, calling from what sounded like his house in Dundas, his voice carrying that particular flatness of a man who has just learned something he didn't want to know. He asked me how I was doing. I told him I was fine. He asked if we could have coffee. I said yes. We met at a place near the waterfront in Hamilton that we'd been to many times over the years. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which had been at the company Christmas party in December. He ordered tea. I had coffee. We didn't talk about the termination for the first several minutes. We talked about his retirement plans, about a fishing trip he had coming up in June. Then he set down his mug and looked at me directly. He told me he hadn't known about the termination before it happened. I said I had suspected that. He told me his son-in-law had characterized it as a mutual restructuring, something I had apparently been open to in private conversations. I told him that was not accurate. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're absorbing something they can't fully believe. He said he understood, then he asked what it would take to resolve the situation. I told him I didn't want to be difficult. I told him I understood the company was moving in a new direction and that I didn't expect to be reinstated. What I expected was what my contract entitled me to: the performance bonus and a formal, properly documented certification transfer process that didn't leave either of us exposed to federal liability. He asked about the timeline. I told him Transport Canada's own guidelines set the minimum, 60 to 90 days, assuming full cooperation on my end, which I was prepared to give. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked me about the son-in-law and whether this was personal for me. I thought about that honestly before I answered. I told him it wasn't. I told him I had spent 24 years at the ministry and 12 years at Meridian doing work that kept people safe on roads and bridges they trusted without thinking about. I told him I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in making sure the transfer was done correctly, the way it had to be done, so that the bridges stayed certified and nobody got hurt, legally or literally. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, I should have been paying more attention. I didn't disagree with him. The next 6 weeks were not dramatic. That's the part of these stories that people don't always tell, but it's the honest part. There was no confrontation in a boardroom. There was no moment where I walked back in and said anything memorable. There were emails between lawyers. There were conference calls with a Transport Canada regional office. There were documents I reviewed and signed and returned. Documents that confirmed the continuity of the certification file. Documents that authorized the eventual transfer once the proper process was complete. The son-in-law, I was told secondhand, was not pleased. Apparently, he had expected the software platform to be operational within weeks of my departure. He had apparently told people, including, I was told, a federal project liaison he had no business speaking to independently, that the transition would be seamless. The federal project liaison contacted my lawyer directly, not Meridian. When a federal infrastructure contract runs into a certification gap, meaning the signing engineer has left and no certified replacement has been formally approved, there are protocols. The project does not pause quietly. It triggers a compliance review. That review goes to the Regional Transport Canada office. That office contacts all parties. It is not a secret process. Meridian received a formal notice of compliance review on April 28th. I know the date because my lawyer told me, with the particular controlled satisfaction of someone who had predicted this outcome precisely. The bonus transfer came through on May 19th. The full $118,000 plus interest as specified in the contract for delayed payment following a dispute. My lawyer took his fee, which was fair and which I had expected. What remained was still more than I had received in any single year before the federal contract came through. I deposited it on a Friday. My wife and I went to a restaurant in Dundas that we'd been meaning to try for 2 years. A proper dinner, not a celebration exactly, more like a breath out after holding it for a long time. My daughter joined us. She's a civil engineer herself, finishing her 3rd year with a firm in Kitchener, and she had followed the whole situation with the particular mix of outrage and strategic interest that I think she inherited from her mother. She asked me, over dessert, whether I felt like I'd won. I thought about that for a moment. I told her I didn't think of it as winning. I told her what had happened was simple. I had done my job correctly for 12 years. I had protected the work by keeping the right paperwork in the right place, and when someone decided that didn't matter, the paperwork proved that it did. That's not winning, that's just being prepared. She nodded slowly. Then she said, Dad, that's literally the definition of winning. My wife laughed. I drank my coffee. The son-in-law is still at Meridian, from what I hear. The software platform he wanted to implement has been shelved, at least for any federally funded work. There's a new signing engineer on the project now. A good one, someone I actually know from my ministry days, and from what I can tell, the certification transfer was handled correctly, and the project is back on track. My original boss sold his remaining stake in the company last fall. He's fishing more. I'm told he's enjoying it. I took a contract position with a municipal engineering firm in Burlington. Shorter hours, closer to home, work I know how to do in my sleep. My wife says I seem less tired than I've been in years. She's probably right. There's something about not having to fight for the thing you built that takes a weight off you. I still drive past overpasses on the 403 sometimes and think about the ones in our report. I think about the assessments, the load calculations, the variance notes, work that nobody sees and everybody depends on. That's the thing about doing it right. It doesn't need you to announce it. It just holds. The son-in-law called me a dinosaur. Maybe he was right in some ways. I do things the old way. Careful, documented, signed. I don't move fast and break things. I move carefully and make sure they last. He's welcome to his opinion. My daughter can look up the bridge reports anytime she wants. My stamp is on every single one. That's enough for me.